The desert stretched endlessly, its orange sand swirling in the hot wind. The smell of blood and smoke still lingered in the air from the battle that had raged for hours. The ground was scorched, marked with the remains of alien creatures and the scattered wreckage of vehicles. Amidst the destruction, the human soldier, his armor battered and dirtied, stood tall but exhausted. His breathing was heavy, each breath a struggle against the heat and fatigue. He scanned the battlefield, his eyes searching for the woman he had fought to protect. His gaze fell on her broken and lying motionless near the wreckage of an alien ship. The sight made his heart sink. She was a warrior, strong and proud, but now she seemed like a mere shell of herself. Her clothes were torn, and the blood from her wounds stained the sand beneath her. Without a second thought, he rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. His hand trembled as he gently touched her shoulder. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, but the pain was clear on her face. She let out a soft groan, her body shaking from the effort to move. "Please, leave me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. She winced as she tried to push herself up, but it was clear she couldn't even sit up on her own. He ignored her plea, pulling her into his arms with a strength she hadn't expected. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly, his voice full of determination. She tried to push him away, her hands weakly pressing against his chest. "You don't have to do this," she insisted. I'm already gone." His eyes softened, and for a moment he almost reconsidered. But he knew she wasn't gone yet. He could still feel the faint pulse of life within her. The battle was over, but her struggle was far from finished. He wasn't going to abandon her now. "I made a promise," he said, lifting her gently into his arms, his exoskeleton wind as it powered up, providing the extra strength he needed to carry her. "You're not alone. But not while I'm here." She didn't say anything more, but her body sagged against him. She could feel the exoskeleton's metal frame pressing against her back, strength supporting them both as they began their journey across the desolate landscape. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The temperature dropped quickly, and the desert grew colder with each passing minute. The soldier gritted his teeth against the growing chill, but he didn't slow down. He could hear her breathing shallowly in his arms, but she hadn't spoken. Since that first plea, he didn't blame her for wanting to give up. She had fought bravely, but the alien forces were relentless, and her body had taken the full brunt of their attack. If it had been anyone else, he might have left them behind. But not her. She had been by his side during the hardest moments of the battle, and now it was his turn to take care of her. The wind picked up, the sand stinging his exposed skin as it blew across the barren ground. He adjusted his grip on her, trying to shield her from the worst of it. She shifted in his arms, her breath hitching as a wave of pain hit her. "I can't," she started to say, but her voice broke off into a cough. "Don't talk," he murmured, his tone soothing. "Save your strength. We'll get through this." She didn't respond, but she didn't resist either. He could feel her body relax against him, her head resting against his shoulder. Despite the weight of the exoskeleton and the exhaustion pulling at his limbs, he kept moving forward, one step at a time. The night came quickly, and with it the darkness of the desert. The stars above were bright, but they did nothing too warm. The cold that was creeping into his bones. The soldier's mind raced as he thought about what lay ahead. There was a settlement, a few days' walk, but in her condition, he doubted she would make it that far, but he couldn't stop, not now. The thought of leaving her behind was unbearable. As they continued, he noticed her breathing growing weaker, her body slumping against his chest. Panic briefly gripped him, but he forced it down. He needed to stay calm. He needed to stay focused. "Hang on," he said, his voice thick with urgency. "Just hang on. We're almost there." She'd barely stirred in his arms, but he could feel her grip tighten on his uniform. It was a small sign, but it gave him hope. He knew she was still with him, still fighting, even if she didn't have the strength to say it. The soldier's steps grew slower, the exoskeleton's servos straining under the weight, but he couldn't stop, not for a second. For hours, they walked through the desert, the soldier's feet dragging in the sand, his body aching from the strain. but he refused to give up. Refused to let her die out here, alone in the cold. Of the night, they would make it no matter what. In the distance, he could just make out the silhouette of a ruined settlement. The faint outline of broken buildings standing against the horizon. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, a place where he could keep her safe. Just a little longer, he whispered to her, his voice full of determination. She didn't respond, but he could feel her weight shift slightly in his arms, as if she was trying to find a more comfortable position. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. The settlement was closer now, the buildings more distinct. He could feel a surge of hope rising within him. They were going to make it. They just had to hold on a little longer as they neared. The settlement, the soldier, took a deep breath, steadying himself. His exoskeleton's power was almost drained, but he could see the faint outline of shelter in the distance. He pushed on, his body screaming in protest, but he wouldn't stop. Not until she was safe. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale glow on the vast, empty desert. The soldier's body ached from the strain of the previous night's journey. His legs felt like they were made of stone, each step dragging him further, into exhaustion. Yet despite the overwhelming fatigue, he carried on, his focus unwavering. In his arms the woman stirred, her breathing shallow and uneven. The battle may have ended, but her fight was far from over. Her body was still weak. From the wounds and the desert heat was slowly draining what little strength she had left. She wasn't sure how long she had left, but one thing was certain: she couldn't keep going like this. And she didn't want to. "Please, just leave me," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She couldn't even lift her head to look at him, but she could feel his steady pace beneath her. He didn't answer, but the determination in his eyes was clear. There was no stopping now. The soldier adjusted his grip on her, trying to make her as comfortable as possible, despite the roughness of the desert landscape. He could hear her soft sighs of discomfort as they continued their journey, but it didn't deter him. His mind was focused on one thing: survival. The exoskeleton's systems hummed as it supported his movements, the mechanical limbs doing their best to lighten the load. Yet with each step, it became harder. The exoskeleton, designed to enhance his strength, was beginning to feel the strain of carrying her for so long. The sun climbed higher, its heat bearing down mercilessly on them. The sand beneath their feet shimmered with the rising heat, and the air was thick with dust. The soldier could feel the sweat dripping down his back, his body struggling to keep up with the demands of the journey. He could see it in the woman's face. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was becoming more erratic. She wasn't sure if she could make it. She had been through battles, pain, and fear, but nothing had prepared her for this. She had never felt so helpless. "Don't do this," she whispered again, trying to push weakly against his chest. "I'm slowing you down. You don't need to. Carry me." But the soldier's grip tightened. "I made a promise," he said simply, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm not going to leave you behind." His words were more than just reassurance, they were his truth. His promise wasn't just to her, but to himself. He had seen too many fall in battle, too many left behind to die alone. This time, he was going to make sure it was different. He wasn't going to let her become one of the lost. She didn't respond. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, meeting his gaze. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to save himself, but the words wouldn't come. She could see the resolve in his eyes, the weight of his decision. For a long time, they walked in silence. The soldier's steps were slow but steady, his every movement calculated to conserve energy. The woman, too weak to resist, simply let herself rest in his arms. Her body felt like dead weight, and every small movement sent waves of pain through her. Yet even through the agony, was a part of her buried deep inside that couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude. She was no stranger to pain. She had been through battles, lost comrades, and survived unimaginable horrors. But nothing had ever made her feel as vulnerable as this moment. It wasn't the physical wounds that hurt the most. It was the emotional weight of knowing someone cared enough to carry her. The soldier's steady pace continued, but his mind was far from at ease. Every step was a battle. His thoughts raced. Where could they find shelter? How much longer would his exoskeleton hold out? He could feel the system's power levels dropping, but there was no choice. They had to keep going. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher, the desert's heat becoming unbearable. The soldier's throat was dry and his vision was beginning to blur. But the woman's weak breathing was his anchor, a reminder that he couldn't give up. Not yet. In the distance, he spotted something, a dark shape against the shimmering heat. A small oasis, forgotten settlement. He didn't know, but he had to try. He pushed on, his legs feeling like they might give way beneath him. At any moment, the exoskeleton's servos groaned in protest, but it kept working, its mechanical limbs supporting his every move. The weight of the woman in his arms felt heavier with each step, but he refused to stop. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and for a moment he thought she had passed out. But then her voice came, barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Soldier paused, his heart tightening at the question. He looked down at her, her face pale and drawn, her eyes searching his. "Because you're worth saving," he said softly, his words filled with a quiet strength. She didn't answer, but her grip on him tightened ever so slightly. It was enough to keep him going. The distant shape was growing closer now, and his heart raced with the thought of finding shelter. But in the back of his mind, another thought lingered. If they didn't make it, if she didn't survive, would he have failed her? Would he have failed himself? But he pushed that thought aside, one step at a time. That was all he could do, and he would keep going, because he promised. And promises were sacred. The wind kicked up suddenly, as though the desert itself was angry at their progress. Sand swirled around them in thick clouds, biting at their skin, blinding their vision. The temperature, which had already been unbearable, dropped sharply, the air turning cold and biting. It was as if the desert had transformed from a sweltering furnace into a frigid hell in an instant. The soldier's grip tightened around the woman in his arms, instinctively pulling her closer to shield her from the sandstorm. The exoskeleton groaned in protest as he adjusted its settings to help him maintain balance. Each step was a struggle, the storm pulling at his body like a living thing, dragging him backward with its ferocity. She stirred slightly in his arms, a soft groan escaping her lips. Her breathing had become even more shallow, and her weight in his arms felt like an anchor pulling him down. She was too weak to speak, too disoriented by the storm's chaos to comprehend what was happening. But the soldier could feel the cold sweat trickling down his back as he struggled to stay upright, the sandstorm making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. "Hold on," he muttered, though he knew she couldn't hear him over the howling winds. His voice felt like an anchor in the storm, a quiet reassurance amidst the chaos. The exoskeleton's servos wind as it struggled to keep up with the brutal forces of nature. The soldier's knees buckled for a moment, but he managed to push himself upright again, forcing himself to move through the storm's rage. He couldn't stop, couldn't afford to stop. The woman's weak body shivered in his arms, the cold beginning to seep through her torn clothing, and he felt the fear grip him. What if she didn't make it through the storm? The thought hit him like a punch to the gut, but he pushed it aside. No, he had promised her that he wouldn't leave her behind. That promise was all that kept him moving. His eyes stung as sand, whipped against his face, blurring his vision. He was barely able to make out the shape of a broken structure up ahead, a refuge, maybe an abandoned shelter. He didn't know, but it was the only thing in sight, and he couldn't afford to waste any more time. His mind raced as he tried to calculate his next move. He had to get them to shelter. They had to make it through this storm, or neither of them would survive. His muscles screamed with every step, his body already on the brink of collapse, but he kept going. The exoskeleton was beginning to give in to the pressure, the energy reserves dwindling, but he didn't care. He couldn't stop. Just a little longer, he whispered to himself, even though he wasn't sure if he could believe it.
Ow.
Every step felt like it might be his last. The storm was unrelenting, and his mind began to cloud with exhaustion. But then, through the dust and the whirling sand, he saw Aton entrance. A small gap in the side of what looked like a crumbled building. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With the last ounce of strength in his body, the soldier staggered toward the entrance. The wind threatened to tear him off his feet, but he dug in, each step a fight against the elements. The shelter, the darkened doorway, providing a brief moment of relief from the storm's fury. He stepped inside. His breath ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The shelter was dark and cold, but it was shelter nonetheless. The wind howled outside, but at least they were safe for the moment. The soldier lowered the woman gently to the ground, exoskeleton's power finally giving out. He fell to his knees beside her, his body trembling with the effort it had taken to get them here. She didn't stir at first, her breathing weak and labored. He watched her closely, his hands hovering over her, unsure of what to do. The storm raged outside, but all he could focus on was her. "Stay with me," he whispered, brushing the hair from her face. His fingers trembled as he touched her skin, the cold from the storm still lingering on her. He tried to warm her with his body, positioning himself to shield her from the worst of the cold. For a moment, it felt like the world had fallen silent. The storm outside no longer mattered. All that mattered was keeping her safe, keeping her alive. Her eyes fluttered open then, her gaze locking onto him. There was confusion in her expression, a mixture of pain and disbelief. She wanted to speak, but her lips barely parted. I told you to leave me," she whispered, her voice weak, but there was no anger in it, just exhaustion and vulnerability. He shook his head gently. "I made a promise," he replied quietly. "I always keep my promises." Lips parted slightly in a faint smile, though it was filled with more sorrow than joy. She was too tired to argue, too weak to resist the tenderness. In his words, the soldier sat down beside her, his back against the crumbling wall of the shelter. The storm still raged outside, but for now, they were safe. He looked down at her, the weight of everything that had happened settling over him. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had made it this far. That for now was enough. As the storm howled outside, the soldier let out a slow breath, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building for hours. But despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, he knew one thing: he wouldn't give up. Not now, not ever. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of silence that felt almost unnatural after the chaos. The desert, once a deadly furnace, had become eerily still under the moonlight. The only sound the occasional rustle of the wind through broken structures inside the shelter. The soldier leaned against the crumbling wall, his legs stretched out in front of him. His body was aching, and the exoskeleton had long since powered down, leaving him relying on sheer willpower to stay awake. He hadn't slept in days, but he couldn't bring himself to rest. Not yet. Beside him, the woman lay on a makeshift bed of scraps and debris. Her eyes closed, her breathing still shallow but steady. She was alive, barely. She had slipped into unconsciousness after the storm, her body succumbing to exhaustion. But she hadn't been lost. Not yet. He watched her closely, his eyes flickering between her and the entrance to the shelter. The desert was dangerous, and the storm had only been the beginning. But for the first time in a while, he allowed himself a moment to reflect on their journey. He thought about the way she had pleaded with him to leave her behind, her voice thick with pain and despair. She had been broken, not just by the battle, but by the sheer weight of survival. She didn't believe she was worth saving. She didn't believe anyone should care. But he had refused to give up. As the minutes ticked by, he couldn't help but wonder why. Why had he gone this far? What was it that had driven him to keep going? The woman's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and hoarse. "You're still here," she murmured, her eyes fluttering open as she turned her head to look at him. I thought I'd wake up alone." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger between them, his expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "I told you I wouldn't leave you behind." She turned her head away, her eyes glancing down at her hands, which were clenched into tight fists. There was a deep sadness in her gaze, and for the first time, the soldier noticed a flicker of vulnerability in her posture. She wasn't just physically broken, she was emotionally shattered. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for your help. I never wanted to be saved." The words hit him like a slap, but he didn't flinch. He had seen this before. He had seen the weariness in soldiers' eyes after battle, the resignation that came when they thought they had nothing left to fight for. But he could see it now in her as well. She was a warrior, strong and capable, but she was running on empty, both physically and emotionally. "You didn't ask for it," he replied, his voice softer now. "But I'm still here. I'm not leaving." Our eyes lifted to meet his, and for a long moment, the weight of her words hung in the air between them. She didn't speak, but something in her eyes seemed to shift a recognition, perhaps of the truth she had been unwilling to face until now. Her body shifted slightly, the movement slow and painful, but there was purpose behind it. She turned, her back to him, pulling the blankets closer around her. The soldier sat still, waiting, unsure of what would come next. But then, after a long silence, she spoke again, her voice trembling. "Why? Why won't you leave me?" The question caught him off guard. He had been expecting her to ask about the journey, about survival, but not this, not the question that went deeper than anything she had said before. He thought about it for a moment, his fingers tightening into fists at his sides as he searched for the right words. "Because you're worth saving, and you deserve a chance, a real chance at life." She stayed silent for a long time, the weight of his words settling in the space between them. He could see the internal struggle in her eyes, the desire to fight against the helplessness that had overtaken her, to reject the idea that someone could care enough to fight for her. "I've fought for so long, bro," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to accept someone else's help." Her words were raw, filled with years of unspoken pain and pride. She had lived a life of independence, of survival at any cost. To accept help now felt like admitting defeat, like giving up the only thing she had ever known, her strength. The soldier's voice was steady as he replied, "You don't have to fight anymore, not alone." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw him not as a soldier carrying her burden, but as a person, someone who saw her for more than just the warrior she had been, more than the person she had tried so hard to be. "I don't know how to believe that," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But I want to. I want to believe it's not too late." He nodded, his expression softening. "It's never too late. Not for you." The words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. She didn't have to accept help right away. She didn't have to believe in him completely. But in that moment, the weight between them shifted. The walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack. The soldier sat quietly beside her, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey, not just through the desert, but through the maze of emotions she had locked away for so long. It would take time. But for the first time, he believed she might be willing to try. The shelter was quiet now, the storm outside nothing but a memory. The soldier sat with his back against the cool stone wall, eyes half closed as exhaustion slowly began to take over his body. His muscles ached, his limbs screamed for rest, but his mind refused to let him relax. Not while she was still lying there, not while she was still fighting for her life. The woman, once proud and fierce, now lay motionless on the makeshift bed. Her breathing shallow, but steady. Her skin was pale, her wounds still raw and unhealed. But there was something else, a faint flicker of life in her that had been absent before. For a moment, it seemed like the storm had taken everything from her, but now in the stillness, there was a chance to recover, a chance to heal. The soldier let out a deep breath, his eyes drifting over the landscape outside the shelter. The desert was deceptively calm now, but he knew the peace wouldn't last. There was danger everywhere, and they couldn't afford to stay here for too long. They had to keep moving. But he wasn't sure if she could handle it. She was barely conscious now, and each breath seemed to take more effort than the last. He reached down, brushing a lock of hair from her face. She stirred at the touch, her eyes fluttering open for a moment, confusion clouding her gaze. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with a quiet desperation. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep you carrying me?" His heart clenched at the words. He knew she was proud, that her spirit had been forged in battle. But she had to understand he wasn't carrying her because he had to. He was carrying her because he chose to. But how could he explain that to someone who had been on her own for so long? "You're not a burden," he said softly, his voice steady, though he felt the weight of his own words. "You're everything to me right now. I'll carry you as long as you need." Her eyes closed again, and she let out a soft sigh, clearly too exhausted to argue. But her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. She was a warrior, someone who had lived her life by her own strength, but now she was at his mercy. And it hurt her more than anything to admit that she needed help. As the night grew darker, the soldier's thoughts turned inward. He was tired, so tired. His body had reached its limits, but he couldn't stop now. The mission had been clear: get her to safety, no matter what the cost. But what if the cost was too much? What if he couldn't keep going? What if the journey had already taken more than he could give? He glanced back at the woman still lying, motionless. Her fragile state was a constant reminder of how close they were to losing everything. Every moment they spent in the shelter was one they couldn't afford. They had to leave tomorrow, no matter what. The thought weighed heavily on him. He had promised to protect her, but the reality of the journey was setting in. Carry her through the rest of this desert? His exoskeleton was near its breaking point, and his strength was fading. The desert was unforgiving, and every step forward would cost them more than the last. He stood up slowly, wincing as his sore muscles protested, and walked over to the small supply crate they had found in the shelter. There were rations inside, but they were running low. Even if he could find more, how long could he keep going like this? How long could they survive on what they had? His fingers grazed the edge of a small canister, and he paused, contemplating the reality of their situation. There was no guarantee that help would come, no guarantee that they would find a safe place to rest or food to survive. He couldn't depend on anyone else. It was just the two of them now. And yet, despite the dire circumstances, there was a part of him that couldn't bear the thought of leaving her behind. She had become more than just a responsibility. She had become someone he cared for deeply. The thought of her being lost, of not being able to protect her, tore at his heart. He took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts. The way forward wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. He couldn't stop, not now, not while she was still with him. When he turned back to her, her eyes were open again, though her gaze was distant. She watched him, her expression unreadable. "Happens next?" she asked, her voice barely audible, but the question carried the weight of everything they had been through so far. "How much longer can we survive like this?" He took a step closer, kneeling beside her once more. There was no easy answer, but he had to give her something to hold on to. "We keep going," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his heart. "We take it one step at a time. And when you're strong enough, we'll leave this desert behind." Her eyes searched his face, and for a brief moment, she looked like the warrior she once was, strong, determined. But that look faded quickly, replaced by something softer, something vulnerable. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted, her voice trembling with the weight of the admission. "I don't know if I can keep going." He didn't have the perfect answer for her. He didn't have all the solutions. But what he did have was his promise, his determination to never let her face the journey alone. "You're not alone," he repeated, his voice resolute. "You'll never be alone again." And in that moment, as the shelter remained silent around them, the weight of their journey hung in the air. The future was uncertain, but as long as they had each other, they would find a way to survive. The silence inside the shelter was broken only by the faint hum of the soldier's exoskeleton, which still clung to his body, its servos groaning under the weight of his exhaustion. Outside, the desert stretched on in its cruel, desolate beauty. But inside, the shelter felt like the last sliver of safety they had. The woman had fallen into a fitful sleep, her body still healing, but her mind a battlefield. The journey had left scars deeper than the physical ones. The soldier sat against the wall, his head tilted back, eyes closed, trying to steal a moment of rest. but his thoughts were a jumbling, overwhelming rush of emotions he couldn't suppress. The weight of the promise he'd made to her seemed heavier with each passing hour. He had vowed not to leave her behind, but each step they took seemed to push him closer to his breaking point. His body was sore, his strength waning, and the exoskeleton's power reserves were dangerously low. And yet the promise still held firm. He would not abandon her. He couldn't help but wonder if she had the same resolve. He had carried her this far, but there was only so much more he could do. She had begged him to leave her, to save himself, but he refused. But what if she gave up? What if, in the depths of her broken heart, she couldn't find the strength to keep going? The silence was interrupted by a soft cough. His eyes snapped open, and he turned to find the woman stirring, her face twisted in pain as she tried to sit up. Her movements were weak, unsteady, but there was determination in the way she held herself. Don't try to get up, he said quickly, moving to her side before she could collapse, but she shook her head. Her eyes clouded with confusion and something else, a deep, unspoken fear. I can't just lie here, she whispered, her voice hoarse and fragile. I have to keep moving. You've done enough. I can't let you carry me forever. His heart clenched as he watched her struggle. The look in her eyes, the same look of stubborn pride and desperation that he had seen countless times in soldiers before, was enough to tell him everything. She didn't just feel helpless, she felt worthless. I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice soft but firm. You're not a burden. You never were. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, as if weighing his words. But I've been nothing but trouble. I've dragged you into this, into my mess. I should be the one carrying you, not the other way around. Her words hit him hard. She was a warrior, proud and fierce, but the emotional toll had left her vulnerable. I chose to carry you, he said, his voice full of quiet conviction. I don't regret it. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her labored breathing. The soldier could see the battle within her, her desire to fight, to stand on her own, but also the realization that she couldn't keep going alone. Her eyes flickered to the door, then back to him, and he could see the conflict in her gaze. You don't have to fight this alone, he continued. Not anymore. We're in this together, and I'm not going to leave you behind. Not after everything we've been through. She remained silent, but the tension in her body slowly started to ease. She hadn't given up on the idea of survival, not yet. But the soldier could see the weight of her pride crumbling, just a little bit. She had fought alone for so long, never allowing anyone to help, but now, for the first time, she was facing the possibility of sharing the burden. Slowly, cautiously, she nodded. I don't know if I can keep going, but I'll try. The soldier didn't smile, but the smallest of glimmers of relief passed through his eyes. That's all I ask. Just take it one step at a time. He helped her sit up fully, steadying her as her legs wobbled beneath her. The air in the shelter felt colder now, the stillness pressing in on them both. But there was a quiet strength between them, an unspoken understanding that they would keep moving forward together. The soldier helped her stand, his hand at her back to steady her, though she still winced in pain from the wound she had suffered. We can't stay here, she said softly, her voice growing stronger as she pushed herself upright. I know you can't carry me forever. Have to get back on my feet. The soldier's gaze softened. You don't have to do this alone. We'll figure it out. Together. She nodded again, her expression resolute, though the uncertainty in her eyes hadn't fully disappeared. But now, something had shifted. She was no longer thinking of herself as a burden, as a weak link in the chain. She was thinking of the future not as a solitary battle to be fought, but as a shared journey, as they prepared to leave the shelter. The soldier looked out into the vast desert beyond. The future was uncertain, the dangers that lay ahead uncountable. But for the first time, he felt a small sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore. And as long as they had each other, they would keep moving forward, no matter how difficult the road. The storm had passed, but the real battle was only just beginning. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, painting the desert in hues of gold and orange. The soldiers stood at the entrance of the shelter, gazing out at the vast emptiness before them. The quiet morning was a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous days, and for a moment, it almost felt like they had a chance, real chance to survive. Behind him, a woman stirred, the sound of her breathing steady but slow. She had been resting through the night, her body finally taking the time it needed to heal, but even in her sleep, there was a sense of resilience about her. A quiet strength that hadn't been there before. The soldier turned back to her, watching as she slowly sat up, her body still weak from the strain of their journey. But this time, she didn't look defeated. She looked different. The burden of self-doubt that had been weighing her down was no longer as heavy. She had been through hell, and yet here she was, still standing. "It's a new day," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet optimism that he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. "We've made it this far. Together." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and focused. For the first time since their journey began, she smiled, a small, fragile smile, but one that spoke volumes. "I never thought I'd make it out of there," she admitted, her voice raw but filled with quiet gratitude. "But I'm here, and so are you." The soldier nodded, his gaze softening as he stepped closer to her. "We're in this together," he repeated, the words now carrying a weight that went beyond their initial promise. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living together. And that made all the difference. She reached out her hand, trembling slightly as she took his. Her fingers intertwined with his, and for the first time in days, there was a sense of peace between them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. "We still have a long way to go," she said, her voice steady now, no longer laced with fear. "And we've come this far, and we'll keep going." The soldier smiled, feeling the weight of the world lift just a little. The future was still uncertain, filled with dangers and obstacles, but for the first time, they weren't facing it alone. They were a team, a partnership forged in the fires of battle, tested by the harshest elements, and made stronger with every step they took together. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the vast desert that still lay ahead. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges to face, more struggles to endure, but they had each other now, and that made all the difference. "One step at a time," the soldier said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We take it one step at a time." She nodded, her expression resolute. "Together." And as the sun rose higher, casting its light over the desert, they took their first step forward, not just toward survival, but toward a future that was theirs to shape. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, they had hope. And with hope, anything was possible.